That's not a comic book. Now that's a comic book.
Hey, welcome to another episode of Trade Talk. This week we'll be talking about Grant Morrison's Multiversity. Now, this will be a very special episode of Trade Talk because it's being pre-edited because of how complicated Multiversity is, and I want my thoughts to be much more collected. I even got a little teleprompter down here, so I'm looking slightly down. That's why. Anyway, let's go ahead and get started, shall we? So normally I don't do written content, mostly because it's more work than off the cuff, but with Multiversity there's a lot of crazy stuff flying by and it's all connected in a freaking spider web of content, so I wanted to try and write this out to more coherently gather my thoughts. I've been waiting to get around to Multiversity for a long time, but I knew it was going to be really complex, so I didn't want to read it in single issues because the time between issues would likely make me forget the important details. And it took me so long to buy the trade because, well, it's kind of pricey. But I'm glad I got it in trade because that allowed me to get this, which is just amazing. The map of the multiverse from a top-down view kind of expresses why this episode of Trade Talk is written out. The DC universe is the bastard child of 1,000 madmen and has become unruly in the complex detail and weird continuity that surrounds DC's multiverse. Whenever I'm unsure of what I think of a piece, I like to look up reviews of it to see if anyone can hit on an idea or theme or something that I'm just not getting or only touching the edge of. But I find with Multiversity, a lot of people get lost in explaining the details of DC's weird continuity, and in doing so, they're missing the underlying ideas of the piece that I found most fascinating. So, I want this review to mainly focus on the metafiction that Multiversity is, and less on the place it holds as a continuity piece for the wider DC universe. However, the way in which this book is structured, it's impossible to not address the continuity because of how interwoven different elements of this are. So, before we continue, let me try to summarize my understanding of DC's multiverse continuity, and also say that I'm not even sure that I get all of what Multiversity is trying to do on both the continuity level and as a metafiction. DC's multiverse is more or less created in the 60s with the crossover of the Barry Allen Flash and the Jay Garrick Flash. Before the two characters had been heroes who shared the same name and gimmick but had nothing else in common. Barry didn't become the Flash because of Jay's legacy. As a matter of fact, Jay was a comic book to Barry. But when they met in person, the idea of a multiverse was created in DC, and the writers ran with it for years. Telling all kinds of stories that got more and more complex until the point of that entire thing became too difficult to manage or understand. So, in the 80s, Crisis on Infinite Earths was created, and all of the multiple continuities were brought together under one singular universe and on one Earth. However, in the 90s, timeline continuity issues began to pop up with this solution, so Zero Hour was made to help fill in that error. Then in the 2000s, DC's writers decided they didn't want to only tell stories in one universe, so they started the event Infinite Crisis to be able to create the multiverse. In 2009, Final Crisis made the mainline DC continuity aware of the multiverse, as well as laid the groundwork for much of Multiversity. Multiversity serves DC continuity as a way to map out and solidify a lot of what DC Universe looks like from a comic level. This is actually a necessary step, and I quite appreciate that. I remember when I was watching Star Trek, for example, I was yearning for some kind of map or system to help position all the stuff happening and had very little luck finding anything. Trying to determine which Earth different versions of Batman and Superman and such are from can get really confusing. It's also weird how much cosmic stuff exists in the DC universe that you don't have placement for, like the Source Wall. Where exactly New Genesis and Apocalypse exist in relation to space, and so on. It's nice that Multiversity helps to place all of that, and does so in a cool way by giving us snippets into different events in these multiple worlds. It really helps to give you a good sense of these comic book worlds with their own history of stories that we've just never gotten to read because they're not the Earth we follow in comics. A number of the issues tell stories that don't quite stand on their own because they're all being affected by the overarching story and crisis that sets Multiversity off, but each in their own way because of the specific conditions under which the crisis is happening. So, that being said, let's get into the meat of the story. The crisis threatening the multiverse, and indeed the metafiction that is Multiversity I keep talking about. Because, believe it or not, they're all the same thing. Me. And you. And anyone else reading or consuming this book. We, the reader, are the threat. We, the reader, are creating the crisis threatening the entire DC multiverse. How? Because we're reading it. We're consuming the art, and so the characters that are being hurt in service to us. Do you feel bad? Because I certainly do. In the very first issue of Multiversity, indeed on the very first page, narration claims, wherever life can take root, wherever life can flourish, in every available niche, no matter how great, no matter how small, life will thrive and life will prosper, given the need, given the opportunity. Where a gap is unexploited, life will come, life will grow. There. You felt it, didn't you? That's them. They found a way in. The life being talked about here is the life you're creating. As you read a book, you bring life to the characters. You give them voice, you comprehend and create their feelings. When something sad happens in a piece, like a character you like dies, you created that death. Oh sure, someone wrote it down or drew the panel it happened on, but you read it. Before you looked, before you comprehended the raw thing in itself, it was just words and pictures, ink on paper. You gave it life. A comic book is just as alive as anything because you bring life to it. You will also take it away. Morrison does something brilliant in Multiversity. He makes the reader a part of the piece, but does so in such a profound and interesting way that I'm not quite sure I've seen before, outside of other Morrison works. This is no choose-your-own-adventure novel. You have no choice as to the direction things take in this story. This is not a Sunday drive around town. It's a runaway train headed straight for a schoolhouse. The only choice you have is whether to continue to make the characters suffer, or to stop and leave them hopelessly in limbo. At several points, the book literally begs you to stop reading it. It warns you not to turn the next page, or the situation becomes even worse. And indeed, you are not spared the trauma of what is happening to the multiverse. Because, as much as Multiversity is a commentary on our effect on art, it's also a commentary on art's effect on us and our thoughts. Sure, we give form and substance to these fictional creations. We may even be tempted to believe ourselves their gods from our perspective here in the real world. But what folly is this? In the issue Ultra Comics #1, the character Ultra makes the point that we as a member of the real world are incredibly protective. There's something about what we're doing. Something I worry about. The borders of your nations are patrolled by soldiers with weapons. You keep your possessions safe behind walls of concrete and stone. Your data is defended by antiviral software, and yet, without even thinking of the dangers, you allowed me, through all your defenses, directly into your heads, where you should be safe. The relation between the reader and the piece is pulled into sharp focus here. Yes, we as readers are truly the worst kind of villain because we put these superhero characters through all kinds of torment for our own personal joy. But what have they been doing to us without even realizing it? Art is not a picture on a wall for you to stare at. It's a heavy machine. Like a machine, you interact with it. You give a part of yourself to it, and it operates. You use force and energy to pump a lever, and it careens into motion, serving its purpose. But, like any machine, it does something, and in Art's case, that something is to move you in return. Think of an old-fashioned train handcart. You put all the energy into it, operate the thing, but it moves you. It takes you somewhere. For every push and pull of the pump, you move just a little bit. For every turn of the page of comprehension of an image, your thoughts are affected by the material. It's important to be cautious of what art you consume. Like any machine, you should know the dangers of operating it. You don't start a car in a small closed room or you'll suffocate on the fumes. Just like the fumes of a car can hurt you. Art presents an idea, an interpretation of the world around you, and whether or not you agree with that interpretation, it still has an effect on you. If you read something and it makes a point about the world you like, suddenly the next time that point is addressed, part of what helped you form your take on it is the art you consumed. Conversely, if something makes a point you dislike, then part of your disdain for it comes from your experience with the piece. You heard some kind of argument you disliked, and worst of all, your brain had to make the argument. If you read the words, or, then you have to understand that those are nothing but words, squiggly lines on a page or a screen, until you consume them. You let those words into your head. You made them ideas. Ideas you have to grapple with. But it's often nowhere near as simple as that. More often than not, those setting down the trap for you to fall into, the artist writing the words, drawing the line, your mind has to interpret and recreate ideas from. They rarely do you the kindness of directly stating their point. Indeed, sometimes they're unaware of points that you can and will find within their work, like trappers accidentally dropping poison bait on their way through the woods. The effect on the animal is the same. Once an idea is in your system, there's no dropping it. You can only live with it. It doesn't matter if you forget. It's still a part of your experience. You're still forever affected by it, even if it's only a minuscule fraction. I'm sure some of you disagree with that. I'm certain some are saying that even if you agree that some art can affect your mind, not all of it does. And that's fine. Delude yourself all you like, but try this. Sit and think for a while about your views on a subject. Doesn't matter what it is. Got something? Good. Where did you get that view from? Do you even remember? How certain are you that a movie, a comic, a show, a novel didn't put it in your head? Or at the very least, enforce it? Maybe you remember exactly where you got it from. Maybe it was directly from another person. Well, where did they get it? Is it at all possible that art influenced them? Maybe your mother or your father is your source. Are they religious? Could it have come from something they read in their holy book? Who's to say that's not a piece of art? See how tricky this gets? I want to transition and talk about the art of the book in the individual issues. I really like the way the different artist styles work in contrast to one another here. In most limited series comics of 4 to 12 issues, you'll maintain a one writer and one artist team. These stories tend to be meant for a trade collection than monthly sales, so giving teams a little more time to work on a finished piece makes more sense than throwing a fill-in artist on a book to make sure it arrives on the shelves on schedule. But that's not the case here. Multiversity uses a number of artists, most of them only hopping in for one issue. In the guidebook issue, 37 different artists lend their work to compiling the plethora of different characters, designs, and teams shown throughout the book. This kind of artist switching can often lead to confusion and a lack of suspension of disbelief on the part of the reader. But because Multiversity depends on taking you out of the story and wants you to think about the implications of how comic books and art in general work, switching artists off and on is a really great choice. The different styles lend themselves to the stories of Armageddon being told in each issue. Ivan Reis does both issues of the Multiversity book itself, and he's known for a very epic and bombastic style, working on several cosmic DC books over the years, from Infinite Crisis to Green Lantern. He perfectly captures the scale and chaos of the quintessential universe-ending event portrayed in his issues. But in Society of Superheroes, Chris Sprouse does some wildly different things with that very much capture the feel of what that issue is trying to hark back to. His more minimalist approach helps the issue feel like one of the old pulp and adventure comics from the 1940s, where a number of the characters originally appeared. His old-timey style mimics the classic artists of the Golden Age, but the subject matter depicted and the scale and violence seen on panel make it still feel fresh and unique to today's modern style. Ben Oliver in The Just has a much more realistic and highly detailed style that perfectly mirrors us as readers in the real world. The characters that read the Ultra Comics issue dismiss the terror and reality of how dangerous something as simple as a comic can be, thinking they're too good for the form. This is reflected in the vivid detail and the way the color palette stands out from everything else in the book. You feel like you're reading a gossip magazine with unflattering pictures that have blurred edges. The characters laugh off the power of the comic, just as the reader may, because they are arrogant. But the characters pay for their arrogance, just as the reader may one day, should they continue to feel so superior. Frank quietly draws Pax Americana in his iconic soft and classic style. The obvious callback to Alan Moore's Watchmen can be seen reflected in the character designs. Captain Adam's resemblance to Dr. Manhattan is the most blatant among them. But as the story of the issue continues, the softer style quietly begins to feel wholly unsuited to the kinds of images shown on the page. This seems intentional, like most everything in the book. I'm in speculation territory here, however, when I say that the reason I believe why Quietly chose to stick with this more charming style throughout the duration of this book was as a juxtaposition between what comics should be and what someone like Moore had pushed to make them. Watchmen being such a horrific story, deconstructing the kinds of stories that not only comics, but superhero comics in particular can tell, has left a scar on the medium for decades. One of the most popular superhero graphic novels ever makes the argument that superheroes are awful and we're better off without them. Pax Americana seems to take that point, run with it, and show just how sick the idea of abandoning mythology like that can be. Quietly's art style juxtaposes the charm and joy and wonder that comics can bring, and displays the kind of imagery and horror that some comics choose to bring. Cameron Stewart on Thunderworld gets to stick with a more dynamic and optimistic art style that heavily calls back to the Silver Age. Just like the story that's being told, similarly to the Society of Superheroes, the style and character designs look nearly unchanged since the era they're referencing. But Thunderworld follows Pax Americana's nihilism and showcases an endless sense of optimism that was indicative of the Silver Age of comics. Stewart has highly expressive characters and communicates a joyful tone where everything can work out in the end, no matter how bad things seem. Jim Lee provides art for Mastermen, a story about an alternate Superman who landed in Nazi-occupied territory as an infant and helped Germany to win the war and eventually rule the world. Lee's epic style is shifted here to be imposing, presenting a sense of dark power. The whole book oozes a fraught sense of combat in an immensely detailed layout that Lee's known for. The look of the book feels like the kind of issue you'd get if comics were published in a far-right authoritarian state. But here the apocalyptic event is a threat to the disgusting ideology of the Nazis. Lee communicates a Nazi Superman who looks and feels imposing, yet is identifiable underneath it all. He also does this without making the Nazi imagery appear cool or anything like that, which is a difficult line to walk under, but Lee managed it well. Finally, Doug Mahnke on Ultra Comics presents a psychedelic, uncomfortable, modern, sleek, unnerving, and horrific style that helps implicitly communicate the otherworldly meta nature of the book. Ultra Comics feels like a real comic book that could come out today. Its visual style and distanced elements make it seem almost mundane, like the kind of book you could find any given week when a big event is happening. This helps lull you into a false sense of security that makes some of the more horrific payoffs that happen later in the book hit even harder. Suddenly something so mundane becomes extraordinary. And you can't quite figure out when that happened. But you also can't stop reading or looking at the grotesque imagery that starts to pop up. Ultimately, I think Multiversity is just fine as another installment, hoping to try to make sense of the DC multiverse. The guidebook certainly helps serve as a nice piece for those interested in figuring out the ABCs of each universe and how stories fit in with the others. But what really makes this book work for me is how it functions as a metafiction that takes great care with how it's telling its story. What kind of artistic style to present in what way and at what time. It is an incredibly well thought out piece where every choice feels both deliberate and methodological. It serves as both a think piece on the nature of art, not only our relationship to it, but its relationship to us. Alright, everyone, thanks very much for watching. That'll do it for this week's episode of Trade Talk. I hope you enjoyed the scripted content. I'm not doing it often. It's a pain. Bye.
That's not a comic book. Now that's a comic book.